So the main question that I'm targeting here refers to a claim that Michel Foucault in his preface to Anti-Oedipus makes. And I'm quoting him. He writes, Anti-Oedipus, may its authors forgive me, is a book of ethics. So Foucault claims that Anti-Oedipus is a book of ethics. And Foucault himself elaborates briefly on his suggestion, focusing on the way Deleuze and Guattari's book can be considered an ethical manual against fascism. And he writes, he calls it an introduction to non-fascist life. But I want to go in a different direction, and I want to elaborate on this suggestion that Anti-Oedipus is a book of ethics in light of, first, Gilles Deleuze's reading of Stoic ethics in his other book before Anti-Oedipus, Logic of Sense, and secondly, in light of Jacque Lacan's discussions on ethics of psychoanalysis in his 1959-1960 seminar, which is published under the same title, Ethics of Psychoanalysis. So Anti-Oedipus is an engagement in psychoanalysis by introducing an alternative, which is called schizoanalysis in the book. So in this book, Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari introduce an alternative to psychoanalysis. They criticize psychoanalysis and introduce their own alternative, and they call it schizoanalysis. I take a brief look to Lacan's formulation of ethics of psychoanalysis, and then I try to explain Deleuze and Guattari's alternative in Anti-Oedipus in that regard. So the title of my talk could be Ethics of Schizoanalysis. Okay, so it's a response to Lacan's reading of Ethics of Psychoanalysis, and then I want to take this alternative. But now I want to explain why I chose this kind of playful title for my talk, Ethics of Psychosynthesis. Deleuze and Guattari introduced the figure of the schizophrenic as a basis for formulating their alternative for psychoanalysis. As I will discuss, at the center of the critique of psychoanalysis is its analytic tendency, which is to say that far from making a legitimate synthesis of psyche, psychoanalysis just analyzes its pre-established structure. So it just analyzes the pre-established structure of psyche in place of really synthesizing it. This pre-established structure is called Oedipus and entails triangular Oedipal family. So this is the main target of Deleuze and Guattari's critique, Oedipus and Oedipal family. Now, in reference to the role of ethics in Deleuze's logic of sense, I will argue that the notion of synthesis, the legitimate synthesis in Kantian sense, namely the synthesis which is used immanently, should be particularly the core of the alternative if it is of the matter of ethics. So my choice of the title aims to discuss what change Deleuze and Guattari make in Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis from an ethical point of view. The problem does not lay on the prefix of psycho, but the suffix of analysis. Analysis is the problem. Indeed, Deleuze and Guattari introduced the figure of psycho as their alternative for Freudian interest in neurotic patients, and therefore they attempt to reformulate psychoanalysis in terms of psychosis in the name of a schizo. Furthermore, as Foucault's suggestion hints, the matter is not just the ethics of psychosynthesis, as I would say, but also the fact that psychosynthesis is ethics. Therefore, the title of my talk could also be Psychosynthesis as Ethics. I kept the current form to imply specifically Jacque Lacan's seminar. In order to compare with Jacques Lacan's seminar, I chose this form for my talk. So this makes me to discuss the nature of desire, unconscious desire, in Lacan, Deleuze, and Deleuze and Guattari. So Lacan's text, Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Deleuze's Logic of Sense, and Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. Desire is the notion that links ethics and psychoanalysis. In fact, psychoanalysis sheds a new light on ethical thought by introducing the unconscious desire. Before Freud, ethical problems were basically considered in terms of conscious will, of course, with some exceptions. With Freud, ethics required to be redefined on the basis of the unconscious desire. So it's a change in ethical thought from a conscious will at the center of ethics into unconscious desire. Now, if Anti-Oedipus provides an alternative for psychoanalysis, and at the same time, as Foucault suggests, is a work of ethics, it is because it gives a reformulation of the notion of unconscious desire. This reformulation, as will be shown, entails defining desire, first of all, as non-familial and non-structural, but rather machinic, and second of all, in terms of production as legitimate synthesis, and particularly in terminology of logic of sense, a synthesis with the event, on which I want to put particular focus. This would ascribe an essential ontological aspect to ethics, which will be discussed. So this is the main task of Deleuze and Guattari's project, in my view, to reformulate the nature of the real unconscious desire. They criticize the existing psychoanalysis for its taking of the unconscious in the image of conscious structures and entities. According to Deleuze and Guattari, psychoanalysis in Freud and his heirs, including Jacques Lacan, fails to liberate itself from the metaphysical bounds of consciousness, and therefore it cannot provide the real unconscious because it remains familial and dependent on persons or personal roles and structures, like the role of the father, the mother, and the child. Deleuze and Guattari summarize this psychoanalytical familialism under the title of Oedipus, as I said. They claim that the real unconscious must be transcendental and not transcendent, which is to say that it must condition the production of conscious entities without being itself on the basis of conscious products. And these persons, the father, the mother, the child, are conscious products. By transcendental, because I use, in my talk, I will use a lot the transcendental unconscious, this title, Transcendental Unconscious. By transcendental, I mean the a priori condition, and the unconscious must be the productive condition of the conscious entities and structures. In other words, psychoanalysis must really synthesize consciousness or psyche instead of analyzing it. It must be psychosynthesis, not psychoanalysis. Family and particularly Oedipal family, is a derivative and produced a structure, and the involved persons are just products. Therefore, the familial structure and the Oedipal unconscious cannot satisfy the requirements of the real transcendental unconscious. This is why, according to Deleuze and Guattari, Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis failed. Although psychoanalysis discusses the pre-Oedipal phase, for example, in the case of Melanie Klein, who uses this term pre-Oedipal phase, but the problem is that it understands it in terms of Oedipus. The pre-Oedipal sexuality in the work of Melanie Klein, for example, is already understood in terms of the relation with the mother as a person. Deleuze and Guattari suggest that what I call schizoanalysis must begin not with pre-Oedipal phase, but rather with an-Oedipal phase, in which production does not have Oedipal structure as its model. So unlike Freud, whose favorite patients are neurotics, Deleuze and Guattari formulate the unconscious in terms of psychosis, and particularly schizophrenia. It is in the figure of the schizophrenic that we should search for the nature of the unconscious desire. The schizophrenic desire is defined as desire as production. According to Deleuze and Guattari, the unconscious is the field of production, and consciousness the field of consumption. But unconscious is the field of production. This is why they replace the traditional Freudian metaphor of theater for unconscious with that of factory. The unconscious is not like a theater, but rather a factory. It does not represent things, it produces them. And desire, unconscious desire, would be machinic. So hence we have the term desiring machines. Desire should be machinic, should be productive. Therefore, if the unconscious is primary and transcendental to consciousness, desire cannot be considered in terms of produced representational entities. Desiring is essentially different from willing or needing. Willing something or needing something. Despite the psychoanalytical account, schizoanalytical or psychosynthetical desire is not negative or on the basis of lack. Desiring here means producing. This is indeed a Kantian formula that Deleuze and Guattari use, because it is Kant who, in the Critique of Practical Reason, asserts that desire produces or causes its objects. So Kant writes, so I'm quoting Kant here, desire is a faculty which by means of its representations is the cause of the actuality of the objects of those representations. But for Kant, desire produces the imaginary objects, and real objects are just there as given. In Kant, real objects are the objects of representation. So desiring produces, but imaginary object, not real object. So Kant is not, of course, Kant is not that revolutionary or radical. And for Kant, the transcendental field only conditions the recognition of pre-existing objects. So being transcendental or being a priori here is just a priori to recognition of pre-existing objects. For Deleuze, rather, both in his monographs and also with his collaborations with Guattari, the Kantian conditioning is just a formal conditioning, and transcendental philosophy must take the genesis of the given as its main problematic. The given is produced, according to Deleuze and Guattari. The given is produced, and its production must be at stake in transcendental philosophy. Therefore, there must be a desire, an unconscious desire, which produces not imaginary, but real objects. And the transcendental and the unconscious transcendental field must condition empirical entities by producing them. So in Deleuze's works, I mean, in Difference and Repetition and Logic of Sense, we do not have this notion of production. We have the notion of genesis and generation, but here in Anti-Oedipus, this notion, this economical notion of production also comes to the scene. So genesis and generation gives its place to this notion of production. So in response to Kant from the outset, in Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari repeat that if desire produces, it produces the real. And therefore, the schizophrenic rupture with the real is therefore a rupture with the phenomenal commonsensical real towards a profound material real, which is the non-representative reality of desiring production. There is an essential difference here between schizophrenic hallucinations and neurotic illusions, and also pervert fantasies. But the point is that the schizophrenic imagination in the form of hallucination is not imagination similar to neurotic imagination. It's productive, material, and real. So this view results in the controversial claim that the transcendental unconscious, I mean, the unconscious as the transcendental field, is external because it produces the external real. So the unconscious is external. The egocentric consciousness takes its closure as a product. The distinction between inside and outside is the product of a transcendental process, a pure process that produces measurable objects, which appear through the distinction between inside and outside. Therefore, the transcendental unconscious must be impersonal and external to personal minds or consciousness. It marks a transcendental exteriority, I would say. In this sense, Deleuze and Guattari's formulation of the unconscious provides a response for Sartre's search for the impersonal and pre-individual transcendental field in the book, the short book, The Transcendence of the Ego. The impersonal and pre-individual transcendental field is the transcendental unconscious, which is an openness to the outside. Consciousness is produced in the world. Hence, the conscious desire is the product of a transcendental unconscious desire, which is in turn the process of production. Consciousness's access to the outside is through representation. But representation itself is produced in the outside world. transcendental unconscious as the process of production is the real genesis and does not require such a representative accessibility. So it is already there, it is already outside. It does not need the representation of something from outside into inside. It does not have any inside. Reality is a pure productive exteriority, out of which interiorities, namely objects and subjects, emerge. In Deleuze and Guattari's later work, in What is Philosophy, for example, this pure productive exteriority is called the pure plane of immanence. The plane of immanence is the real as the productive transcendental field, in my reading. So in this regard, in reference to Kant, Deleuze and Guattari claim that the transcendental unconscious as the site of real production is marked with immanent use of synthesis. It produces through immanent synthesis. The transcendental field is the field of synthesizing, and true synthesis is the immanent one, the one which does not have a transcendent model. In this way, the transcendental unconscious contains the empirical consciousness by synthesizing and producing it immanently. So transcendental unconscious, or the real, the pure exteriority, synthesizes within itself objects, subjects, and consciousness. On this basis, Deleuze and Guattari criticize the existing psychoanalysis. And I quote from Anti-Oedipus. What they, psychoanalysts, do is merely to make the unconscious speak according to the transcendent uses of synthesis imposed on it by other forces, global persons, complete objects, grand phallus, the terrible undifferentiated of the imaginary, the symbolic differentiations, segregation. So these are all the transcendent principles that apply to unconscious and reduce the unconscious in psychoanalysis and stops them to generate in its term. Deleuze and Guattari's alternative, schizoanalysis, makes the unconscious to speak according to the immanent uses of synthesis, which is to say, it synthesizes from within itself without receiving a transcendent model of how to synthesize. It produces without a transcendent model for production. As mentioned, production here is indeed synthesis, but not the transcendent synthesis of complete objects by a full subject. It is the immanent synthesis of partial objects. This constitutes the core of Deleuze and Guattari's account of desiring production. If the relation of the psyche with outside is called experience, it is experience in terms of production. The unconscious experience is what through which the subject and the object of experience are under production. So it's not representational, not at all. The unconscious is not the site of cognition or the possible experience of a fully produced subject, but rather the site of the real experiences of a subject which is permanently under production in the course of its experience. Now we have a double formula in defining desire. It is desiring production, and it entails an exteriority. It is what brings the entity outside of itself. It marks the pure plane of immanence. This relation between desire as production and its exteriority is at the center of my reading and constitutes, in my reading, the ethics of psychosynthesis. It is what refers us to Jacques Lacan and to Deleuze's Stoicism. Lacan, in his 1959-1960 seminar with the title Ethics of Psychoanalysis, formulates his view of ethics around the following question. Have you acted in conformity with the desire that is in you? So this is Lacan's formula of ethics of psychoanalysis. Have you acted in conformity with the desire that is in you? Obviously, Lacan is well aware of the exteriority of desire in this formula. The desire that is in you is different from your desire. This formulates the ethics of psychoanalysis in terms of the relationship between the unconscious desire and the conscious will. So when he asks, have you acted in conformity with the desire which is in you, it means that you can act in conformity with which or not. So there is a gap, there is a spaltung between your will and the desire which is in you. The conscious will must be regulated in conformity with the unconscious desire. This is the definition of ethics. The conscious will must be regulated in conformity with the unconscious desire. You should act in conformity with the desire which is in you. In this way, Lacan's formula would be compatible with the Stoic formula of ethics, which can be summarized as living in accordance with nature or living in harmony with nature. As the Stoic formula implies, nature here signifies what is exterior or external to the living subject and is beyond his conscious control. Such an exteriority is exemplified in the Stoic thought with the notion of death. So ethics is about learning how to live with your death, something which is external, exterior to you. Stoic ethics is a method to learn how to live in conformity with your death, with the inevitable factuality of your death. Deleuze's specific term for this exteriority in logic of sense is the event or fate. In logic of sense, in 21st series of the event, in logic of sense, Deleuze introduces Joe Bosque as a true Stoic who takes his inclination for death, it's a quote, inclination for death or desire to death, as the truth of his desire. The truth of desire is desiring your death. So this is Joe Bosque's Stoicism in Deleuze's view. And I'm quoting from Logic of Sense, where Deleuze explains these Joe Bosque's Stoicism. It is in this sense that the amor fati is one with the struggle of free man. My misfortune is present in all events, but also a splendor and brightness which dry up misfortune and which bring about that the event once willed is actualized on its most contracted point on the cutting edge of an operation. End of quote. Deleuze translates the Stoic passivity in relation with the exterior event into what constitutes the interior of free man. So man is free when he or she can interiorize the absolute exterior event. This entails, of course, a tension within will or desire, which is indeed the tension between consciousness will and unconscious desire when I will the exterior event, namely death, my death. Therefore, the Lacanian formula of acting in conformity with the desire that is in you can be translated in the Deleuzian terminology of logic of sense into making a passive synthesis with the event, incorporating the exterior event within yourself, and in short, loving your fate, amor fati, this Stoic slogan. As mentioned in Anti-Oedipus, this exteriority receives a more ontological register in terms of machines. Everything is a machine, and the machine is composed of the flows of desire and interruptions of these flows, or fluxes of desire, or flows of desire. My desire is what in me, which is exterior, which is to say, is the same as what flows in nature. What Deleuze and Guattari take as machines are natural machines, and nature is composed of machines as what interrupt, break, and connect the flows of desire. Ethics is the practical affirmation of the flow of desire as my nature, an affirmation which is evental. Desiring production as the immanent synthesis is the processual synthesis or the flow itself. This renders the synthesis with the event in me as the practical affirmation of the exteriority of the event, my death, as my essence and my nature. Human nature must essentially be the exterior nature itself. The Stoic living in accordance with nature implies a whole, a conflagrant fire which synthesizes immanently, and my consciousness is just one of its ephemeral products. But the fire, the Stoic conflagrant fire, burns in me, or if you like, works with me, as well as in any entity. And this fire is the unconscious desire. So desire is a name for the Stoic conflagrant fire, or for the flow of existence, and it's my unconscious desire. It's the trace of that reality or exteriority in me, and this is why it turns me apart, my consciousness apart, my illusionary consciousness, So this ontological nature of ethics receives also a social register in Anti-Oedipus. Ethics as the glue of societies, what connects people together, is defined in Anti-Oedipus as the pre-individual socius. The socius marks the pre-individual sociality of desire. In the third chapter of Anti-Oedipus, the primitive existence of the transcendental socius is the earth, the very materiality of the earth, which leads to the emergence of territories and group identities. The primitive societies are not familial in the sense of Oedipal families. And in Anti-Oedipus, In the third chapter, Deleuze and Guattari spend a large part of that chapter to show that primitive societies are not familiar, are not audible, and we cannot find the roles of father, mother, child in those primitive big families or societies. So societies, primitive societies are not familiar, are not composed of these triangular structures. It is only later, under despotism and through the mediation of the imperial state, that the role of the father appears as mirroring the task of the despot God. And then under capitalism, this role receives an independence and generates the nuclear families. This is indeed the history of the emergence of persons, conscious persons. Therefore, it is wrong to understand the essence of societies as the common needs of established individuals, because these individuals are just historically produced, and there is a material sociality prior to their emergence. And this is why Deleuze and Guattari in Anti-Oedipus repeat that social production and psychic production are the same thing. Social production is psychic production. So it is because there is a transcendental sociality, a sociality which is prior to my individuality, my individual mind. So psychic production, in the sense of conscious production, is secondary, and my unconscious psychic production is essentially social. So it has an essential social aspect, which is shown with the term of the socius. It's also wrong to understand ethics in terms of the relationship between conscious individuals and their needs or their wills. There is an a priori and ontological ethics in terms of the flow of desire or material socius in nature. So this is what I would consider the ontological aspect of ethics. If ethics is the matter of desire, and desire is indeed unconscious desire, it is external, and it is a flow, the natural flow, which is there, and it flows also in me, but because I am part of that reality. So this is the ontological aspect of desire, of ethics, excuse me. In this way, we can link Lacan's Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Deleuze's reading of Stoic ethics, and Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus as a book of ethics, as Foucault claims. What connects these three is a similar approach to the unconscious desire. But as mentioned, Anti-Oedipus at least is critical against Lacan as remaining within Freudian Oedipulism. Deleuze and Guattari's relationship with Lacan is indeed very controversial. And for the rest of my paper, I focus more on the differences and similarities between Deleuze and Guattari's project and Lacan's project in Ethics of Psychoanalysis. But I think it's better to leave it for the publishing paper.